First speaker, let me tell a story about the first speaker. I've been learning, so since I started coming to Laracon, I have decided I'm going to learn how to code. And the way I do that is I basically call up Adam Wathan on Skype and get him to show me stuff. And I videotape it and put it out on YouTube and stuff. And the other day, he taught me how to write my first 12 lines of Vue. And I posted this on YouTube, and someone commented, they're like, "Oh, way to go. That's like learning a basic spell from Gandalf." So I want you guys to give a warm welcome to Adam Wathan, Gandalf.
Hello, how's it going? All right, so talks are short this year, so I'm not going to waste any time. My name's Adam Wathan. I've been involved in the Laravel community for a long time, but lately I spend most of my time working on this CSS framework called Tailwind CSS. How many people here have used Tailwind for something before? Cool, so a bunch of people. So for anyone who hasn't used it, here's kind of the TLDR. So normally when you're trying to build something, say we're trying to build this little chat notification component, you might write a bunch of HTML like this, put together a bunch of classes like chat notification content, whatever, right? And then go ahead and open up your CSS file and implement all those classes, and bang, you're done. Everything's styled. The way that you'd build this same thing with Tailwind is more like this, where you have all these horrible, ugly classes that you use instead, like P6 and ML6 and TextXL and stuff like that, right? But the cool thing is that when you build something this way, using Tailwind, you don't actually have to write any CSS at all. So the way that I like to think about Tailwind, because a lot of people kind of have this idea that oh, this is mixing everything, this is ugly, this is crappy. The way that I kind of beautify it in my head is by thinking, Tailwind is really like an API for your design system. So instead of writing HTML, inventing class names, jumping over to your CSS file and implementing them, your HTML instead becomes sort of a consumer of this class-based API, where everything that you've sort of built in your Tailwind CSS file defines all of the sort of allowed or available style rules that you can add to any of the components in your project. So like box shadows, for example. Maybe you decide, okay, these are the 5 box shadows that we want to be able to use in our project. These are sort of the elevations in our design system. So there's a class for each one, and you just slap it on an element if you want to add that shadow. Or same with things like text sizes, text large is supposed to be this size in our project. We just slap the class on, we get it. No more going to your CSS file, mucking around with hard-coded values. Everything comes from this sort of constrained set. So it's a little bit of a weird way to work at first, and kind of seems like a little bit contrary to sort of all the advice you've probably ever heard about writing CSS your whole life. But I find that in practice, this is actually really practical and productive, because maintaining CSS is a nightmare, and editing HTML is super easy. And the thing that I think is kind of interesting about this is a lot of people kind of will think well, it's supposed to be hard to maintain. It's only good if it's hard to maintain, but it should be a lot of work, That doesn't make any sense. If it's hard to maintain, then it's bad. That's the whole point of trying to write good code, so that's easy to maintain. So if writing your styles this way is easier to maintain, then maybe it's not such a bad idea after all. So what I'm going to be talking about today, a talk that I've always wanted to see other framework authors give as sort of a user of those frameworks, is how do they use it? How do they solve common problems? I'd love to see Evan give a talk on here's how I build a Vue app, and here's a walkthrough of my thought process. Or Taylor, here's kind of a tour of a Laravel app that I built and why I named my controllers this, why I organized things this way, or whatever. So I thought, well, I made this CSS framework. Maybe people would be interested in seeing sort of how I solve common problems with it, and what I think is sort of the idiomatic way to use it, and how to deal with things that maybe seem a little bit trickier at first. So today we're just going to be talking about sort of a bunch of principles and practices that I like to keep in mind and follow when I'm building applications using Tailwind CSS. So the very first one is to extract components, not classes. So let's head over to some code here. So I've got this little kind of splash page demo that I put together here. And here is all the code for it, right? So a common thing that people will run into is they'll see something like this little button down here, and they'll look at the code and see, okay, well, we've got 13 classes to build this button. There's a real good chance I'm going to want to use this button multiple times on my site, And copying and pasting all these classes all the time seems like maintenance hell. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want, if I decide to change the border radius on a button, I don't want to have to change it in a million places in HTML files. So Tailwind has a cool feature for trying to solve this problem that lets you kind of like extract out common repeated utility patterns. So if we head over to like our app.css file, I'm just going to copy all these classes. You can do something like this, where you could say, okay, well, maybe we want to create like a button class. And we want this button class to just be like kind of the abstraction on top of all these utilities. So instead of writing all the CSS by hand, we can just say apply, paste in the list of classes, and then head back here, replace this with button. And now it looks exactly the same. And if we wanted to add more buttons, we just use that same class, and we're good to go. If we wanted to change the border radius on all these buttons, we have a single source of truth for it now, right? Which is kind of cool. So that works really well for these sort of really small, like single HTML element sort of abstractions. But I find people try to abuse this feature in places where I think like there's a better solution. So here's like another example. See down here we have all these sort of cards with his image and title and link and stuff like that. In the HTML, here's kind of how that's implemented. So we just have this like blade loop that spits out a bunch of columns that have all these utilities building up all these cards. So the first thing to understand, I think, is that trying to create these abstractions is only really a good idea if you're trying to solve a duplication problem. So it's only really when you're actually repeating stuff in a bunch of places that you want to create sort of a single source of truth. So in this case, there actually isn't any duplication because we're actually just doing it in a loop. If I want to change the border radius for all these items, I can already do it in one place, right? But say we were reusing this card somewhere else on the site or in a different part of the page and we were copying and pasting it. Okay, now you have like an actual duplication problem you might want to solve. So something that I see people do that I think is sort of an anti-pattern is they jump into their HTML and they think, oh, well, I used apply to kind of solve that button problem. Maybe I can use it here too. Maybe I'll create like a destination card class, and maybe this is like a destination card title. And then they'll head over to their CSS and use apply and sort of build up all these styles. The problem with this approach, in my opinion, is that this list of classes is only really one part of the duplication problem. It's all of the different styles that are used, but the thing is, when you have this sort of complex component, you still have to worry about the structure and the elements. So even if you can actually abstract away all this list of classes into reusable component classes, you're still copying and pasting all this HTML everywhere. If you decide, okay, actually this should be an H4, not an H3 in all these cards, you still have to go through every single place where you've pasted this HTML and update that. So you've sort of only solved half the problem. So I think a better way to solve this problem is to extract like an actual JavaScript component or even like a Blade template partial. So I've already gone ahead and done that, and I'll show you kind of the outcome. So say we were doing it with Vue, we could just kind of pull in like a destination card component here and just kind of bind in like the current destination from the loop. Right? So we just like JSON encode this stuff. And with any luck, if we've done this right, and I get rid of this div, because that's not right, everything's still the same. And if we head over to this destination card component, well, now there's actually no pressure to extract any classes here because we still have a single source of truth for the list of utilities. I can still change the border radius for everything just in one place. And you can do this exact same thing with Blade, right? So if you wanted to do this with Blade, Blade has just like includes for partials, right? And the cool thing about includes is they're actually parameterizable. So we could do like include, partials.destination card. And you can actually just like pass through what should be in scope there. So we can just say like destination. It's cold up here. My hands are struggling to type. Destination. And if we did that right, for no typos, everything, still shows up. And now if we go over to that, Blade partial, again, we can do like the same thing. We can just like, okay, we want all the corners to be square. Now they're square. We have that single source of truth. So if you're using something like Vue or React, you can extract a Vue or React component. If you're just doing sort of a vanilla server-rendered Blade thing, you can still apply the exact same principles. So in general, I think it's a better approach to solve these kind of component issues using real components. I'm not trying to do it purely with CSS because you need to solve the HTML duplication problem too. And when you solve the HTML duplication problem, you actually have no CSS duplication problem left to solve. So that's kind of the first thing that I think is important to keep in mind. Next one, no Sass, no problem. So a lot of people are super, super accustomed to building their sites with preprocessors like Sass or less, and they're used to features like sort of like build time imports or nesting or variables and stuff like that, and they don't want to like lose those features when they start using something like Tailwind. So I personally don't use Sass or less or anything like that with Tailwind, so I just wanted to show you a quick demo of sort of what my workflow actually looks like. So instead of using a preprocessor, I just use post CSS. So this is what my like webpack.mix file usually looks like. So instead of like .sass or anything, I'm just using .post CSS. Here's sort of my input file, where I want to spit it out. And then these are the 3 plugins that I use most commonly. So post CSS import solves that sort of import problem, so it lets you kind of organize your files and structure them in however you want. So if you go ahead and look at my my app.css file, right now we kind of have it just using like the vanilla Tailwind way, right? I'll show you how I actually do this normally though. I just have a bunch of import statements like this, and I don't use like the @Tailwind stuff. So now I have an import for Tailwind's base styles, an import for my own custom global styles, an import for Tailwind's components, then an import for any of my own custom components, then Tailwind's utilities, then my own custom utilities. That's sort of like the basic structure I use for every single project. So now what I would do with this like button class, for example, is instead of putting it in this file, I would just head over to my like components.css file and keep it in here. And then everything works the same. And now you can break up your files and sort of organize them however you want, kind of like you're used to with Sass or less. So the other plugin that I use a lot is, and I wouldn't say a lot, but I use it frequently, is PostCSS Nested, which handles sort of the nesting problem. People like to nest things in Sass because it makes things sort of feel more contained and organized. I'll show you a real world use case of where I actually would use this with Tailwind. So if we head over to another URL here, here is an example of a page where we're like rendering some markdown on screen, right? So if we look at like the route, you can see I just have some markdown content. We're sending it to a view. You can imagine in a real project, maybe this is like content someone typed into a CMS, like rich text editor or something. And the HTML that's generated when you compile markdown, of course, has no class attributes. And Tailwind is all utility classes, so how do you actually style this stuff? So the way that I do this is by creating a class that sort of targets all of the global selectors inside of it in a sort of a scoped way. And I'll show you the implementation here. So if we head back over to our components.css file, we've got like a secret component here at the bottom, this markdown component. And all I'm doing is like setting up some basic typography styles, adding some space between each element, styling like the H1, styling the anchor tag, styling the lists, that sort of thing. So now when we head back over to like the view, I can just like drop this markdown class in, and now we have some basic typography styles. So this is the sort of situation that I personally use nesting in. And it's only really because it makes it feel kind of more organized, right? We know that we're trying to target stuff that's nested under this markdown class, so this kind of mirrors the structure of the HTML a little bit better instead of just duplicating this prefix everywhere. It just feels a little bit tidier. Pretty superficial, you don't really need it, but if you miss that nesting feature, that's how I would do it. I would pull in this PostCSS nested plugin. So the benefit of using PostCSS for everything instead of Sass and then PostCSS is everything is way faster because you're only running through your CSS and compiling it once. And you're not sort of like mixing tools, and there's some gotchas that you can run into when you're kind of combining things too. So this makes the workflow nice and smooth. All right, next. Use SVG like it's going out of style. So I use SVG for everything, all the time. So I'll show you some common use cases. So the most common one is like doing icons, right? So here's like a couple storefront icons designed by my friend Steve down in the front row. What's up, Steve? So the cool thing about using inline SVG for stuff is that you can add classes to your SVG elements because they're just in your HTML, and then you can use Tailwind's classes to style them. So here we're using the height and width utilities to just like set the icon to whatever size that we want, right? Cool, kind of convenient. You can do the same thing with colors. So here we're saying make the fill of the SVG match the current text color, and then we just set the text color to change the color of the icon. So this saves you from writing a bunch of weird custom CSS or exporting images with stuff baked into it or whatever. It's just much nicer if you can just drop inline SVG in and then style it using that same design system API that you're using to style your HTML. So real world, kind of more cool use case. Here's like a little search input. And I think the way that a lot of people would build this is this icon, they would implement it using like a before pseudo element or something to try and get it positioned and kind of bury all that information in the CSS. With Tailwind, the philosophy is kind of like your CSS is this sort of pure, untouchable place as much as possible, and your HTML is where you're actually building your UI. That's where like you're actually putting stuff together. So the way that I would build this is using an inline SVG for the magnifying glass. And the cool thing about doing it this way is I can say, okay, I want the magnifying glass to match the current text color, and then sort of in the wrapper element above, I say, okay, well, I want the default text color to be gray 600, but then whenever any element inside this div is focused, using this focus within variant, I want the text color of this div to change to blue. So since this input is inside, now whenever the input is focused, the icon changes to blue. And I was able to sort of compose all this behavior directly in the HTML without even having to go and write weird CSS. And this is the sort of thing that I think at first glance, you would almost immediately assume I have to write custom CSS to solve this problem because there's all these sort of dependencies between these elements. But it turns out by sort of structuring things this way, you can still do everything in the HTML, which is really neat. Another example. So we had that splash page we were looking at, right? Say we wanted to kind of tweak it to add this cool sort of like diagonal slant to it. Again, this is the sort of thing I think a lot of people would try to implement with like before and after pseudo selectors. I think it's cool to do this with SVG instead. So let's just kind of do it on the fly. So I'm going to head back to our homepage here. And we'll just look at this on like this large breakpoint. It's a little small. You can kind of get the idea. I think it's more important that we see the code than the design here, but maybe I can give us a little bit more room. So I'll show you how I would actually build this. So the important thing to think about, or to see here anyways, is this is implemented using sort of two halves. So this half is kind of all this content, and then we got this half over here, which is where this giant image is. So what I'm going to do is in the second half, I'm just going to create an SVG shape and overlay it on top of things. So what I want to create is sort of like a parallelogram. So we got like a shape that's like kind of like this, and I'm going to center that over the seam in between the two pieces so that it looks like we have this diagonal slice. So here's like a fun little exercise. We're just going to literally create an SVG image by hand, by typing it out, instead of like in Sketch or something like that. So I'm just going to create an SVG. I want it to be like stretchable by the browser. So I'm going to say preserve aspect ratio none. And then we need to create like a canvas size using ViewBox. So since we're able to stretch it, the easiest way to sort of draw the shape in terms of understanding the coordinates is just to make it a simple square. So I'm just going to make it a 100 pixel square, which is nice and easy to understand. Okay, so now what we want to do is create this actual parallelogram. So I'm going to create a polygon, and then we need to define some points for the polygon. So the first point is going to be in the middle at the top. So that's going to be 50 on the x-axis, 0 on the y-axis. Then we're going to be all the way to the far corner, so 100 on the x-axis, 0 on the y-axis. And then we're going to be at the bottom in the middle, which is going to be 50 on the x-axis, 100 on the y-axis. And then in the bottom left corner, which is going to be 0 on the x-axis, 100 on the y-axis. So I don't think we'll see anything right now, but if we add some classes to this SVG, we'll give it absolute position so we can actually just see it to start. Make sure that we kind of got the shape right. Yeah, okay, and there's our sweet parallelogram. So I'm going to use inset y0 to kind of lock it to the height of the parent, h full just to be safe, kind of see what that gets us. Okay, so now it's kind of filling the right amount of space. This background color here is BG gray 100, and we want it to sort of blend in. So let's do fill current and then text gray 100 so we can set the color of this to match. And now we have to kind of give it a size. So right now it's way too wide, right? So why don't we give it a width of like 32? And that's going to change kind of the angle too. So that's getting closer. And then to center it, we're just going to use some negative left margin of half of the width. So we'll do negative ML16. And there we go. Now we have that kind of thing in place. So like how much cooler is it to be able to just do that in your HTML instead of writing all this hacky CSS? How many times have you like been trying to debug something and like been go through dev tools trying to find these weird elements and figure out what screwed up class it is? This is so much easier, right? It's like right there in the HTML. Tweak it. It's cool. All right, more. Don't be afraid to extend the framework. All right, so I get so many people opening issues on the repo saying, oh, how come you don't have this feature? How come you don't have this feature? And the thing is, for every site, there's always going to be a thing or two that Tailwind doesn't support because either we didn't think about it or because maybe only your site needs it, no one else's site needs it. So we sort of anticipated this and tried to build the framework to be extendable as possible and to sort of give people guidance on how we recommend extending it. So I'm going to show you how I would extend the framework today. So let's pull up another example here. I've got this drop-down example. So we just got this little like drop-down that opens, right? But it's kind of boring because it just kind of pops into place. There's no like animation or anything. Now Tailwind doesn't actually have any transition or animation classes built in because we haven't just really had the time to really figure out a great kind of generalized API for it. So this is something that I end up kind of implementing myself in a lot of projects. It's just kind of a way to test out what kind of the nicest way to do it is. So I'll show you all the classes that I created because we don't have time to just do everything from scratch. And I'll just kind of explain it. So the first thing to think about when you're extending Tailwind is you don't want to just open your CSS file and write a bunch of like custom hyper project specific CSS. You want to think like, what is my design system missing? And how can I sort of extend my API to include the things that I need to consume? So in this case, we need like some sort of like motion system, some sort of positioning, transformation system. So the classes that I've added are not like very specific to this project. It's just me trying to create like another set of generalized utilities that I can use in whatever way is useful to me. So I want this dropdown to pop out of the right corner. So I know I need to set the transform origin, but instead of just adding the only one I needed, which is this, I do a little bit of investment up front and try to figure out, okay, what are all the things that I might need and put them all in at the same time. Same for like what properties do I want to transition. I know in this case I wanted to be able to transition all, but I thought, you know what, it's pretty common to want to transition the color or the opacity of the transform separately, so I'm going to add all those at the same time. You want to sort of like invest up front to add everything that you need so that you don't have to keep coming back and editing the CSS, because that kills like the whole workflow that we're trying to achieve. Same thing for transition speeds. So I probably only need 1 or 2 for this particular animation, but I invested some time into figuring out a good set of durations to add. Same for easings. So I defined a couple of easings that I think will be useful. And then I know I wanted that to sort of grow as it sort of animates into place. So instead of just adding the scale stuff that I needed, I came up with a system. Like, what's like a reasonable amount of values to have? Let's add them all, so now I can consume them whenever necessary. So I'll show you how I would do this. So let's go to this drop-down example. So let's add a transition component here. We're using Vue, because that's kind of the quickest and easiest way to do this. And I thought a lot of people using Laravel are comfortable with Vue, so it seemed like a good choice. Now, what a lot of people will do with Vue is they'll do like this transition name thing, and you can do like name fade, and then you have to create all these custom classes like fade, enter leave, fade interactive, whatever. There's a better way to do this when you're working with Tailwind that makes things a little bit more composable. I'll show you how to do it. So first, let's add this origin top right class to the dropdown kind of content so it comes in from the right spot. And now what we're going to do here is instead of just giving it a name, we're just going to override what classes Vue uses. So I'm going to say enter active class, leave active class, enter class, leave class, enter to class, and leave to class. I'll kind of organize these nicely. Okay, so when the animation is happening, when it's entering, what do we want to sort of be active? So we want to be able to transition everything. So we're going to say transition all, because that's what we called it over here, right? We want it to maybe pop in pretty fast. So maybe we'll go like transition fastest. And we need to set like a speed. So maybe we'll have it like ease out, so it kind of slows down as it enters the screen. Now for leaving, let's do transition all. Whoa, cold fingers. Maybe we'll have it leave a little bit slower, so we'll go with faster, and we'll have this ease in, which is a little contradictory in your head, but we want the animation to like be slow at the beginning and fast at the end as it kind of pops out. So enter class. So what should the state of it be before it shows up? Well, maybe we'll have it be invisible, so opacity 0, and maybe we'll scale it down to like 75%. And then at the end of the animation, we'll have it be full opacity and like the full scale. And then we'll do the opposite on leave. So we'll start full opacity, full scale, and we'll transition to invisible and scale 75. So if we didn't screw this up, it should animate now. Yeah? Pretty cool. And the cool thing about this is it's all composable, right? So if we want to change what properties we're animating or change how it's working, again, we can do this all in our HTML. We don't have to go write custom CSS to do it. All right, let's keep banging through this. Prefer inline styles to weird custom classes. Okay, so here's another example of that homepage we were working on, but kind of a different treatment. So we got this kind of image in a box, and then we got this like blob behind it, right? Beautiful blob designed by my beautiful friend Steve. So here's the blob. It's like this sweet purple pork chop. So I think what a lot of people would do if they were trying to implement this is they would end up trying to create some weird class like hero BG pork chop and write all these like weird CSS rules to kind of get it into place. Because this is 100% the sort of thing where you're going to be like top, negative 117 pixels, right, whatever, right? Show you how I would do it instead. So let's jump out to another URL here. We'll go to the old blob URL. And here's how I would do it. So over in the blob, I've got the SVG kind of here, but just nothing done to it yet. So when we drop it in, we get this, right? Which is, I would say it's pretty close, but it's not quite perfect yet. So how I would solve this problem is I would literally just start adding inline styles. So first I'm going to do like style width. Let's make it match like the intrinsic width of the thing, so 768 pixels. And then maybe for top, I might do like negative 110 pixels, and then right like negative 150 pixels. I don't know, whatever. It's arbitrary. We're just going to start with something. Oh, pretty good, actually. I actually didn't know those numbers. I was just so good. But what I would literally do is I would just start like playing with this here and trying to get it looking kind of how I want, you know what I mean? Until it's kind of right. And again, these are just weird values. I wouldn't want these to leak into my design system because they're not really design system values. So I would just kind of fine tune it here. Now you might be thinking, well, what if this needs to change at different breakpoints, right? Like maybe at like the small screen, like this is like garbage. You can't add media queries to an inline style, so what's the solution? My solution is to just duplicate the whole thing and just hide it at different breakpoints. So here, maybe this one will be hidden on like large screens and up. Like this isn't going to be perfect because we don't have time to like show every single variation, but we'll kind of do it anyways. And then large block. So now we have two copies of it, and we can sort of edit the one that appears on this screen independently from the other one. So maybe we'll make this one smaller. Maybe this is like 380 pixels or something. And okay, and maybe it's not quite as like high off the screen. And again, I would just be like fine tuning this by hand to try and like get something that I thought looked cool. You know, bring that down a bit. Maybe it's not quite as far off to the right, it's like 150 or something. Maybe it's like 100, I don't know. Yeah, like that looks pretty cool, right? And now when we jump back to like the other breakpoint, well, we still have like the other version of it instead. So that's how I would kind of solve that problem. Again, everything kind of focused in the HTML as much as you can. All right, last kind of thing I want to talk about, removing unused classes with Purge CSS. So by default with Tailwind, if you do like a production build and wait half an hour for it to compile, you know, this is like when you go and argue with people on Twitter about active record versus data mapper or whatever. And then we head over to our public app.css file. You'll see that the file Tailwind generates by default is like pretty aggressively large. It's like 360 kilobyte CSS file. And the reason for this is because, again, Tailwind is designed to be this like API for your design system. So it's supposed to contain everything you could ever need to build your site. In reality, you end up only using like 5% of the classes, because maybe you do use like MT4, but you don't use like MD ML6 ever, just by chance. It obviously makes sense to exist because it's part of your design system, but you might not use that particular value in that specific case, so the class kind of goes to waste. So the solution to this is to use this awesome library called Purge CSS that'll just remove any CSS you're not using. So the easiest way to do this with Tailwind, since we only got 50 seconds here, is to just require Laravel Mix Purge CSS by our good friends at Spotsy. However you pronounce that company's name, I don't know. Love those guys, but I'm from North America, so. So you just throw that in at the top, then kind of add it at the end here. And then if we do another production build, we'll see, Purge CSS slows things down even more, but that's okay. Now our CSS file is only 6.7 kilobytes. In gzipped, it's 2 kilobytes. And everything still works and looks the same. All right, so that's all I got. End of the talk, the end. Thank you so much for checking out Laracon. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.